Good morning. Welcome to this ICER meeting, a special assessment of outpatient treatments for COVID-19. We'll be starting in approximately 1 minute. Thank you for attending.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this meeting to assess special assessment of outpatient treatment for COVID-19. My name is Reem Mustafa. I'll be chairing today's session. I'm an associate professor at the University of Kansas, and I direct the outcome and implementation research here. I do not have any financial conflict of interest to disclose, and I would like to start by introducing individuals of the CEPAC members. At the beginning of every CEPAC meeting, we want to ensure that all speakers disclose any financial relationships with industry. Every member of our CEPAC panel who is present today has met the ICER conflict of interest policy. With each CEPAC member, please introduce yourself, your work, and note whether you have any updates to the declaration of conflict of interest that are already included. I'm going to start calling different members, starting with Dr. Eric Ambrecht.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Arbrecht. I'm a professor at St. Louis University School of Medicine. So it's an honor to be with the CEPAC today. And I have no conflicts of interest for this meeting. Thank you.
Dr. Kurt van den Bosch.
Good morning. My name is Kurt van den Bosch. I'm a pharmacist with St. Luke's Health System in Idaho, and I have no conflicts of interest. Thank you.
Dr. Aaron Curl.
Hi, I'm a health services researcher, professor of pediatrics and chief health officer at Indiana University, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Dr. Don Casey.
Good morning. I'm Don Casey. I'm an internist. I'm associate professor of medicine at Rush Medical College in Chicago, and also adjunct faculty of the Jefferson College of Population Health and affiliate faculty of the University of Minnesota Institute for Healthcare Informatics. No disclosures.
Ms. Neha Dave.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha. I am a patient, and I'm also the executive director of Generation Patient, which is a nonprofit that focuses on adolescent and young adult patients, and I have no disclosures to report.
Dr. Stacy Tusantzino.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stacy Dusatzina, and I'm an associate professor of health policy at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, and I'm a health services researcher. I have no conflict of interest for this meeting.
Ms. Heather Guidon.
Good morning. I'm Heather Guidon. I am the program director and the research coordinator of the Center for Endometriosis Care. I have no financial or other disclosures.
Thank you. Dr. Jill Johnson.
Hi, my name is Jill Johnson, and I am a pharmacist and professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences College of Pharmacy, and I have no updates to my conflict of interest statement.
Thanks. Dr. Tim McBride.
Hi, I'm Tim McBride. I'm a professor at Brownsville, Washington University, and co-director for the Center for Health Economics and Policy here. I have no updates to my disclosure that I filed already.
Thanks. Professor Rachel Sachs.
I'm a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare.
Thanks. Dr. Stuart Winston.
Good morning. I'm Stuart Winston. I'm a cardiologist, clinically retired, and currently head of a patient experience coaching program in a large multi-specialty group affiliated with Trinity Health, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I have no conflicts to report.
Thanks. Last but not least of the panel, Dr. Ingve Falkjader.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ingve Falkjader. I'm a professor at Case Western Reserve University at Cleveland. I have no additional conflicts to disclose. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Very happy to have you all here. We're now going to introduce our clinical experts and patients. I'm going to start with Dr. Adarsh Bimraj.
Thanks, Reem. Hi, everyone. My name is Adarsh Bimraj. I used to be the head of Neuro ID and a staff clinician at the Cleveland Clinic. I'm about to take a job at Houston Methodist. So as I like to call it, I'm fun employed right now between jobs. I've chaired the COVID-19 guidelines, most of the treatment guidelines for the last, I think, more than 2 years with Reem and Ingve. So it's been kind of a very interesting perspective, especially because I see patients daily during the mornings, and I'm sure like everybody else at nights, we are doing guidelines. So it's an honor and a pleasure that I've been invited to be part of this group. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Dr. Bimraj. Next is Dr. Ed Mills. I'm not sure if he's here yet. He will be joining momentarily, but Dr. Mills is a professor at the University of McMaster, and he is specifically, just trying to get here to the right screen. He's specifically really directing and leading some of the important trials in this space. And he does have, as we see on the screen, stock ownership and employee status at Keitel. He received funding from ICER Bioscience for the Together trial, which is a trial that we will kind of be informed by. Next is Ms. Linda Goller-Blount.
Good morning, Linda Goller-Blount. I'm an epidemiologist and president and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative. We're the nation's only national organization focused on Black women's health and the health of women of color. And we are grant recipients from Hologic and Gilead. Happy to be included in today's conversation. Thank you.
That's great. Welcome to all of you. I'm gonna just remind all of us and request from all other speakers, including policy roundtable participants and individuals making public comments, that they should announce any financial relationships with industry or other potential influences on judgments that they will be making today when they speak. And we will also present this information on slides in front of us. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Steve Pearson, who is the president of ICER. Steve, to you.
Thank you, Reem. And hello again to folks joining us through the webcast and to the Midwest CEPAC. Next slide, please. So we are doing this meeting, as you will hear several times. This is a special assessment, and there are lots of different reasons that it's special. We have Midwest CEPAC members who are recovering from COVID today. We have all experienced this condition, this situation, this kind of civilization changing event in lots of different ways. And we're here today for multiple reasons, but we want to start with the patient's, kind of experience and perspective. And it's obviously very different for different people, but here's one person's experience. I was very scared. I have diabetes, COPD, and asthma, but I didn't want to go to the hospital. I'd seen bills as high as a down payment on a house. I tried to do research at home, but COVID-19, isn't like a cold or the flu where I could drive to CVS and get cough syrup. I felt helpless and really like my only choice was to go to the emergency room, and I eventually did. They gave me an infusion and that helped, but I was nervous the whole time because I'm allergic to a lot of medicines. What if it didn't work and I got worse? There's so many different aspects to this pandemic, individual, societal, obviously, lessons learned for all of us. But we're here today, again, to center our thinking in the experience of patients who need information, who are struggling to understand what to do when they start to feel sick. And this has been a moving target for the last 2 years. So in this special assessment, we are going to try to look at the evidence, but consistently realize that the landscape has been shifting and will shift, and we'll have to keep that in mind going forward. Next slide, please. And if you click through here, so we're talking about new treatments that are still largely under emergency use authorization or pending consideration of an EUA. But let's talk for a second about another reason we're here today, because the second that these treatments do receive some form of FDA approval, there is a lot of things happen. There's an initial sense, though, of celebration, actually, of excitement that we have new treatment options. There was yet another one just in the paper today, a treatment for more seriously ill patients in the hospital. But every time we start to learn about new treatments, I think it expands our horizon of thinking what we can do or offer patients like the one whose quote I just read. It's also a sense of celebration, and maybe it's not as well recognized, but I think it has been over the past 2 years, that companies, clinical researchers, and patients are all invested and have taken risks in participating in efforts to bring these treatments forward. So when we get one that the FDA deems ready for use in some way, there's a sense of celebration, and that we welcome these things into treatment. On the other hand, questions still abound. So on the evidence side, especially in a rapidly moving landscape like this, we are, even with FDA approval, we are left thinking, what are the risks and benefits for me as an individual patient, for clinicians, for their population, for states, for countries? How do we put this evidence into context, not even for the individual treatment, but again, how it might compare to other options if we are lucky to have them? So how these treatments fit into this evolving landscape is one of the continuing questions as the landscape changes. There are also questions that we have to ask, obviously, certainly at the national or societal level and even the global level, about what are reasonable prices and the costs to patients themselves, to the health system, if we still want to think of that as an independent entity within the entire infrastructure of care, and the government. And we'll talk a lot today about the government's role in the funding and the delivery of these treatments. So we're here today partly because we're still trying to learn lessons, trying to extract them from what in many ways has been like, the fog of war, in which you always think you know what you're going to be doing, but you never know what the enemy is doing. And, you make mistakes, you make guesses, you move forward, you try to learn as you go. So we're going to talk a fair amount, especially in our policy roundtable at the end of the day, about what we can learn from our experience developing drugs, trying to learn about their effectiveness and risks as quickly as possible, getting them into the hands of clinicians and patients, and figuring out how to pay for them in a sustainable format that respects, if you will, the incentives needed for the innovation we're seeing, and needs to itself set precedents for the innovation that we might yet need going forward, both for this pandemic and certainly for ones in the future. So a lot of reasons we're here today, a lot of ground to cover. Next slide. You have heard introductions to the members of the Midwest Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council. Let me tell you a few words about ICER, which is the hosting organization and the group that did the research behind the report that will serve as the foundation for the discussion, especially this morning. Next slide. So ICER's our own kind of conflicts of interest, if you will. We keep an updated picture of our funding overall. And as you can see, about 74% comes from a series of nonprofit foundations, including California Healthcare Foundation, Commonwealth Foundation, and others. The chief funder within that set of nonprofit foundations is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. We do receive about 20% of our overall funding from a combination of contributions from manufacturers and from health plans and provider groups. That money is assigned to a separate activity around our ICER Policy Summit and white papers, so that is not used to support the research and the meetings on these kinds of drug value assessments. And we have a small amount of revenue coming from subscriptions to our ICER analytics platform. You will hear a little bit more about that today as we use it to explore some of the uncertainty around the modeling and government contracts and others. Next slide. So the report, again, that is in the backdrop of this report, of this discussion today, starts with guidance during a scoping phase, as we call it, guidance that we get from patients and patient groups, from clinical experts, from the manufacturers who are relevant, and other stakeholders, including payers, as we try to figure out, again, what are the key questions about the evidence? What are some of the key aspects of the arc of innovation here that we need to try to build in? And most importantly, what really are the concerns and the questions and the experience of patients and their families that should kind of help frame our efforts. So with that at the outset, we then do a staff evidence review by ICER staff, and we do cost effectiveness. We sometimes do that with outside academics. In this case, the cost effectiveness analysis was helmed by our own Mel Wentington, from whom you will hear later. Our report goes through several cycles of public comment and revision. Often additional comments come in from the patient groups we're engaged with, as well as the manufacturers. And then we were fortunate to have 3 expert reviewers, Dr. Badley, Dr. Gandhi, and Dr. Shankaran, as you see here, all active in the field here, particularly in infectious disease, thinking about these issues. And so we got comments from them before finalizing the evidence report. Now, the report itself is structured in a way to help support the sequential discussion we'll have today about these treatments. Next slide. Yeah, okay. And if you will, there are kind of 5 different ways that we think about the value, the long-term value for money, which will be the culminating vote that the Midwest CEPAC will take on these treatments after hearing the discussion around the evidence. So we obviously start in thinking about value around whether these treatments can help patients live longer. They can also gain health benefits, though, from the ability to return to their physical functioning. Treatments may have obviously more or less side effects in comparison to other treatments, and that's a part of their value. We always look at the total costs of treatments within the health system, not just the cost of the pill or the IV, but the cost of how it might influence hospital visits downstream, number of hospital days, number of other treatments that need to be taken. So a very broad view. And when we talk about the modified societal perspective on cost, it will also include costs that could come from the ability of patients to return to work earlier or their family members. And here we'll also talk about other effects that might occur to the care of patients in the hospital that care that might be influenced if we can keep more patients with COVID healthier and out of the hospital. We also, though, talk about what we sometimes call benefits beyond health or other potential benefits that could accrue from treatment that are hard to capture sometimes, but no less important. They might, and we'll hear about things obviously for COVID, in terms of whether treatments might influence our ability to increase opening of schools or workplaces, whether it reduces the risk of infection of others by treating the patient themselves. So we'll talk about those other potential benefits. And also, we always talk about whether there are special social or ethical priorities. And that the word ethical or social will mean different things to different people. But in particular, we're interested in whether there are aspects about the severity of the condition or the burden of illness for the patient and their families, that even if we capture the benefits to their health from treatment, whether there might be broader effects for them or for others in the community that we need to capture and discuss as part of overall value. So that's all in the report, and it will all be part of the discussion today as we move forward. So the next slide, I believe, shows the agenda for today's meeting. Again, after these opening remarks, we'll turn to the presentation of the evidence, both the clinical and the economic evidence. We'll have public comment, followed by approximately 45 minutes to an hour for lunch. Then we will return for further deliberation and voting by the Midwest CEPAC. And after that, we will have a policy roundtable with patient experts, clinical experts, representatives from payers and from the manufacturers, again, to try to focus on those lessons, both what we'll do today, but even more perhaps what the lessons learned so far and what we need to keep our eye on as terms of other lessons we can learn from this experience to continue to do better and also to make sure that we get set up well for, if you will, future prevention and treatment of new infections. So we'll finish with reflections from that policy roundtable and the members of the Midwest CEPAC and be adjourned by 4 p.m. Central Time. All right, with that, I believe the next slide, I'll be able to hand it off to Dr. Kai Young, who is the evidence author on this report, and he will introduce himself further. So Kai, you're welcome to start off.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Kai. I'm a pharmacist and a pharmaceutical economist by training, and I'm a research scientist at Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute. And I'll be presenting the clinical evidence. Next slide, please. My key collaborators from ICER include Molly Beinfield, Rashim Mohammed, Abigail Wright, and Emily Nahn. Next slide, please. Since the start of this pandemic in 2020, there has been over 80 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, and roughly 1 million COVID-19 deaths in the United States. In the context of this rapidly shifting public health landscape, there has been a dramatic change in the variants of concern, with approximately 100% of cases in the US now being of the Omicron variant. And from preliminary CDC estimates, the Omicron sublineage BA2 appears to be the most prevalent variant in the United States right now. There has also been evolution in population vaccination rates, with vaccination rates reaching approximately 70% right now in the United States. Among individuals who are infected with SARS-CoV-2, roughly 10 to 20% are asymptomatic. Among those who are symptomatic, approximately 80% go on to develop mild to moderate disease, and the remainder, 20%, develop severe or critical disease requiring hospitalization or oxygen support. The risk factors for developing severe disease are manyfold, but some of the key ones include older age, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and chronic lung diseases. Next slide, please. So the scope of our review will include patients who are non-hospitalized for mild to moderate COVID-19, who are at high risk for progression to severe disease based on their risk factors. The interventions that are included in this review include 3 oral agents, molnupiravir, Paxlavid, and fluvoxamine. There are other treatments that were previously available or are currently available for our population of interest. In terms of previously available treatments, there are 3 in which the emergency use authorization or the EUA was revised such that they are not currently authorized in any US region. These include Regencov and Sotrovimab, which was originally in our draft scoping report, as well as Bamlanivimab and Etesevimab. These EUAs were revised because they were found in vitro unlikely to be effective against the current Omicron variant. In contrast, we do have some in vitro data from molecular binding assays, as well as laboratory cell models that suggest that molnupiravir and Paxlovid may be effective against the current Omicron variant. There are also some treatments that have a recent emergency use authorization or approved indication for our population of interest. This includes remdesivir, bebtelovimab, as well as PEG interferon, in which the manufacturer for that one is currently pursuing an emergency use authorization based on recent promising data. Next slide, please. So a little bit more of detail regarding our treatments of interest. Molnupiravir is similar in mechanism of action to ribavirin. It is a nucleoside analog that inhibits SARS-CoV-2 viral replication by being incorporated into the viral RNA, resulting in replication error. It's given as 4 pills twice daily for 5 days. When it was initially issued an EUA by the FDA in December of this past year, it was restricted to individuals above or equal to the age of 18 and is not recommended for individuals who are pregnant. That EUA was further revised to limit it to usage to individuals without alternative FDA-authorized COVID-19 treatment options. Paxlavid is a protease inhibitor that blocks the activity of a key SARS-CoV-2 protease, which is an enzyme necessary to produce other functional SARS-CoV-2 proteins. It's a combination treatment, including nirmatrelvir, which is the protease inhibitor, as well as ritonavir, which is used in this setting to reduce the metabolism of nirmatrelvir and thereby increasing the concentrations of nirmatrelvir in the blood. Given as 2 pills of nirmatrelvir and 1 pill of ritonavir twice daily for 5 days. Fluvoxamine is a SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Its mechanism of action for the treatment of COVID-19 is unknown. One theory is that it binds to a sigma-1 receptor, thereby modulating the body's response to inflammatory response. It's given as 1 pill twice daily for 10 days. It is currently approved and is a generic medication for obsessive compulsive disorder. And there is a university-based group that is pursuing an EUA for COVID-19. That's in contrast to molnupiravir and Paxlavid, which currently possess an EUA for the population of interest. Next slide, please. Our primary outcome of interest is relative risk reduction in hospitalization or all-cause death within 28 or 29 days as compared to placebo. Our secondary outcomes include mortality, serious adverse events, and discontinuation of treatment. There's also other secondary outcomes that we include in our written report and in our supplement as well that we won't touch on in this presentation today. Next slide, please. Based on our conversations with patients and with caregivers, we learned that caregivers are heavily involved with supporting the activities of daily living for the patient, especially when patients are discharged from the hospital. Patients were very concerned about the substantial financial burden of COVID-19. Whereas COVID-19 testing and vaccines are covered without out-of-pocket costs, there's no federal requirement that plans fully cover the cost of COVID-19 treatment. And so COVID-19 hospitalization in particular was a major expense for some patients. Patients were also concerned about the limited access to diagnostic testing, which reduced their ability to be diagnosed and therefore treated. With these concerns in mind, patients were open to trying new treatments. Next slide, please. So I'll cover the clinical evidence as summarized by the key trials. So this table here describes some of the characteristics of those trials. I'll point a few things out to you all. The first thing to note is that there is only 1 key trial per intervention, as opposed to the more typical 2 pivotal trials. Next highlight box, please. All right. So you'll notice that in terms of the dates of enrollment and the percent of US patients that were enrolled in these trials, that there's substantial variation in these characteristics across the trials, which makes it difficult to compare across these trials, given the rapidly changing prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 variants across time and across geography. Next highlight box, please. All right. Primary outcomes in terms of for molnupiravir and Paxlavid are similar, right? It's hospitalization for COVID-19 or death from any cause. So fluvoxamine is slightly different in that the primary outcome there is assessing emergency setting admission for greater than 6 hours or transfer to a hospital by day 28. And that reflects the limited hospital capacity at that time in Brazil, where this trial was conducted during one of the heights of the COVID-19 waves. Next highlight box, please. Overall, baseline characteristics were similar across the trials, except for a few notable characteristics that I list here. Notably, obesity, percent vaccinated, molnupiravir and Paxlavid trials excluded individuals who were vaccinated. Fluvoxamine had a revision in their protocol in which they had included a small number of individuals who were vaccinated towards the end of the trial. Notably, none of these trials were conducted at a time in which the Omicron variant was prevalent. Among the one trial that reported genotype data, which is molnupiravir, had roughly 30% of patients who had Delta variant in terms of SARS-CoV-2. In terms of these baseline characteristics, they do differ from the real-world studies that we identified. Patients in these trials tended to be healthier in that they were younger and had fewer chronic conditions as compared to individuals who were from the real-world studies. This perhaps reflects on the fact that we found lower rates of hospitalization and death in these trials relative to the real-world populations. Next slide, please. All right. So this is a slide on the primary outcome. Next highlight box, please. Okay. In terms of the primary outcome, you'll notice that there were relatively low rates of hospitalization and death, as I said, especially in the molnupiravir and Paxlavid studies, slightly higher for the fluvoxamine. That's true for the intervention and control arms. Next highlight box, please. And next slide, next highlight box. All right. Based on these risks, the studies calculated a relative risk reduction. What we find that overall these treatments were effective in terms of reducing the risk of hospitalization or death. Next box. Okay, so we'll highlight a few things. With molnupiravir, we see a notable drop in relative risk reduction or efficacy relative to placebo, going from the interim report and the final study report in terms of 48% relative to a 30% reduction. We don't have a good understanding as to why that there is just this substantial decrease in efficacy. It's rather unusual. The manufacturer has suggested that the distribution of patients differ between the first phase and the second phase of the trial, and that's something that the FDA has asked the manufacturer to look into. Next highlight box, please. You'll also notice that with the Together trial for fluvoxamine, in the intent to treat analysis, which is the primary analysis, there's a 30% relative risk reduction. However, there were, as you'll see 2 slides from now, there was a substantial number of patients who discontinued treatment, both in the intervention and in the control arms, and in a per protocol pre-specified analysis in which the study investigators looked at individuals who were at least 80% adherent to treatment, the relative risk reduction or the effect size nearly doubled, roughly doubled, looking at that analysis. So next slide, please. Secondary outcomes. In terms of mortality, you'll notice that there aren't sufficient events in any of these treatment arms to really draw firm conclusions regarding the effects of these drugs on mortality. Next slide, please. In terms of harms and serious adverse events, you notice that there are few serious adverse events, both in the interventional and control arms of these trials. You also notice that the point estimates tend to be lower in the intervention than the control arms, and most serious events, adverse events, tend to be COVID-19 related. Next highlight box, please. Okay. So looking at the Together trial, again, what I pointed out earlier is that there is a substantial number of patients who discontinue treatment of fluvoxamine as well as the placebo. It's not entirely known why there is such a discontinuation rate. It may be possible that it's because of the longer duration of treatment, which is 10 days for fluvoxamine versus the other 2 treatments of interest, which is 5 days, and people may be feeling better and discontinuing treatment spontaneously. Also, there's a later initiation of therapy as compared to Paxlavid and molnupiravir for this fluvoxamine trial. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number of uncertainties that apply to all these interventions. First is that there's only one phase 3 trial for each intervention in the population of interest. There's also a large number of limitations regarding generalizability. First is that there's rapid evolution of the SARS-CoV-2, leading to variants with treatment resistance and different morbidity and mortality impacts. There's enrollment of a generally healthier and lower risk and predominantly unvaccinated population from the clinical trials. Hospitalization rates were from pre-Omicron variant and based predominantly or exclusively in countries outside of the US. So to the degree that the Omicron variant has lower hospitalization risks, the cost effectiveness of these treatments may be reduced. There's also uncertainty regarding real-world access to these treatments, in that the federal government is revising strategies regarding funding of these treatments and their rapid testing and treatment strategies. Next slide, please. So there are intervention-specific uncertainties and concerns as well. So with molnupiravir, as I mentioned earlier, there's this drop in efficacy between the interim and the final study results. There's also concerns regarding mutagenicity, teratogenicity, and toxicity to growing bone and cartilage. Based on this mechanism of action, as well as based on laboratory data, there's these concerns. And with mutagenicity, based on its short course of therapy of 5 days, the FDA considers this risk to be rather low. However, the FDA has restricted the use of molnupiravir to individuals greater than age of 18 or greater than or equal to, and recommended individuals who are pregnant not to use this treatment because of concerns about teratogenicity and toxicity, growth, bone, and cartilage. There's also concerns about viral mutation based on both its mechanism of action of causing viral replication error, as well as some data on a subset of patients from the pivotal phase 3 trial move out that suggests that it can cause viral mutation. But however, none of this has, there's no evidence that this causes the emergence of spike protein amino acids that would result in a rebound in a viral shedding or prolonged detection of the virus. With these concerns in mind, the FDA has suggested that molnupiravir be only authorized as for individuals for whom there's no alternative FDA authorized or approved COVID-19 treatments. Paxlavid has a large number of known drug interactions. These include important therapy classes such as anticoagulants, antiplatelets, antiarrhythmics, anticonvulsants, and immunosuppressants, as well as statins. And some of these interactions are likely to be more common in patients, specifically those who are at particularly high risk for COVID-19, such as immunosuppressed patients. It's not recommended for patients with severe renal or hepatic impairment. And because it acts on one mechanism, the SARS-CoV-2 protease, there's a potential for evolution of resistance. With fluvoxamine, there's uncertainty regarding the primary outcome definition, this composite outcome that we discussed earlier, and it had no statistical significant effects on viral clearance, time to hospitalization, hospital length of stay, death, or mechanical ventilation relative to placebo in the key Together trial. There were also concerns about treatment discontinuation that we discussed earlier. Next slide, please. In terms of potential other benefits and contextual considerations, one benefit is its impacts on society's goal of reducing health inequities. COVID-19 has had a higher prevalence and greater severity in communities of color in the US, and non-white COVID-19 patients and patients in rural areas appeared less likely to receive neutralizing antibody treatments for COVID-19. So if these oral treatments of interest are fairly distributed, then these drugs would have some role in reducing the ongoing disparities in care in these disadvantaged communities, in that these neutralizing antibody treatments require administration by a healthcare professional, typically in an infusion facility or a hospital. In terms of reducing the spread of COVID-19, molnupiravir and Paxlavid in their key trials demonstrated a reduction in viral load, and therefore theoretically could reduce the likelihood of treated individuals to spread SARS-CoV-2. However, this hypothesis was not explicitly evaluated in any of those studies. In terms of providing support for policies to manage the pandemic with fewer restrictions on schools and businesses, to the degree that these outpatient treatments are effective, they can provide psychological reassurance for the opening of schools and businesses. Next slide, please. So to summarize, this is a special evidence assessment performed in the context of rapidly evolving evidence, as well as many data limitations, including changing prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 variants, changing national vaccination rates, having one key trial in the population of interest for each study, and the trials being less likely to be comparable to one another in that they were conducted at different times in different countries with different outcome definitions. With these considerations in mind, we do believe that these drugs of interest do reduce hospitalizations among the population of interest. There are important limitations to the use of each drug, including with molnupiravir, pregnancy and among children, with Paxlavid with its known drug-drug interactions, and with fluvoxamine with regards to its uncertainty regarding efficacy and concerns around adherence. Next slide, please. With those considerations in mind, we rate that Paxlavid has a B+ ICER evidence rating, meaning that it has a small to substantial net health benefit, and that fluvoxamine and molnupiravir have a C+ rating, meaning that it has a comparable or null to small net health benefit. All right, next slide, please. All right, with that, I think we'll open up for questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Young, for this pretty well-organized and comprehensive presentation. I'm keeping an eye to see if anyone from the CEPAC members have any questions. And okay, well, we have Dr. Don Casey. Please go ahead.
I thank you for that great overview. One question on the grading. What is the sort of context for the grading? In other words, it's obviously under certain circumstances from the past, right? So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that. Obviously, we're dealing with different situation. I know we're going to get into that, but what are your thoughts about that that evidence grading in that context?
You mean the evidence grading as it applies to the current situation with the Omicron, or
no? Well, I think less so, but more just understanding the context of the grading in that past set of circumstances.
Okay. I think I still need a clarification. Do you mean the differential grading between the treatments, or something else that I'm not understanding in terms of context?
Yeah, you're sort of looking forward in terms of stating its effect, and what I'm saying is it was effective then, and I'm just asking if that should be included in the statement or used around the statement.
Yeah, I think that, so evaluating these treatments in its effect and efficacy and safety, so net health benefit at the time in which these trials were conducted. I think that's your question. I think that these evidence grades do reflect that evidence. If you look on slide, let's see, 24, which, sorry, maybe a little bit further back, slide 23. In terms of efficacy, like each of these treatments do demonstrate, statistically significant efficacy in reducing the primary outcome of hospitalization and death in the study population that they were studied. It's hard to compare across trials, but there is maybe some evidence to suggest that it may be Paxlavid may be slightly more effective. That's the interpretation certainly of the NIH clinical guidance. There's in terms of their statements. There's also concerns with regards to molnupiravir in terms of its safety profile, and there's some uncertainty with regards to fluvoxamine for this reasons to be discussed. And therefore, I think it warrants that differential grading between Paxlavid and the other two treatments.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Dr. Falkadler next.
Hey, thanks so much for the great presentation. I believe that actually the company, the molnupiravir manufacturer, had to actually submit some additional animal data, I think this month, just for the question of the somatic mutation. I haven't seen anything. Maybe you've had some early access to this. Because in the end of the day, particularly when we weight that evidence, we really need to figure out, is there a net benefit to this? And so it really boils down to putative and very plausible potential massive downsides that we can't really quantitate at this point. So I want to hear your personal opinion. What do you think is actually the likelihood that you could get an escape mutation of the virus, which would be massive, or the somatics, mutations that people feel very uncomfortable about? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that we have some great clinical experts that might be able to weigh in on that question. So perhaps we can defer to them.
Okay, well, we have Dr. Ed Mills and we have Dr. Adarsh Bimraj. Any of you would like to comment on that?
So Reem, I think no amount of clinical experience with a drug which you have not used will answer that question. So again, it's a new kid on the block, Kai. We don't have a crystal ball. And I had the dubious pleasure of listening to the 8-hour FDA UA on the presentation. I don't have access to the new data. I think we're all being cautious right now. All the data we know is at best in vitro and some in vivo. And like Ingwei said, I think it is a judgment call. It's putative and plausible. I haven't seen any in my experience, but also there's been not a lot of use of molnupiravir given the other agents as well. So clinical experience itself is sparse to adequately comment on any of those concerns. I don't know if there's any other primary care people, I'm an ID physician. I think I see sicker patients. I don't know if somebody else has more experience with molnupiravir, and I have not noted any major concerns for the few patients I've used.
Yeah, just to add one detail regarding the FDA statement on carcinogenicity, so not on mutagenicity, is that they believe that because of the short course of therapy, it presents a low, carcinogenicity risk.
Okay, well, sounds like some concerns, a lot of uncertainty has presented itself and not much use because potentially there are other alternatives. I see Dr. Jill Johnson. Please go ahead.
So just to reiterate, so with even getting molnupiravir out of the, if it's not being used, for Paxlovid, are there any data that were not included in this that are emerging that might lead us to believe that it would be effective in the new variant, whether it's in vitro or what have you?
Yeah, there is in vitro molecular binding assay data, as well as cellular in vitro assay data that suggests that Paxlovid, as well as molnupiravir, are effective against the current Omicron, BA2 variant.
Maybe I'll ask a follow-up question to that. So just trying to contextualize, how does this in vitro data translate into clinical efficacy? So we're really dependent, for the most part, a lot of our effect estimates are dependent on the numbers we see from the trial to even discuss efficacy and cost effectiveness and all that, right? So the fact that the medications may be, that they might work against some of the new variants, or does that translate into, is it appropriate to assume that the same relative risk reduction that we're looking at for the old variants will apply to the new variants? Or does it say that maybe they work, but we don't know what's the relative risk reduction?
Yeah, that seems like a really hard one to answer. A really good question. I'd like to hear whether Dr. Bimraj or Dr. Mills have a response to that.
Sure, Ed Mills here. Good morning, everybody. So we have kept our trial going from the very beginning, which means that we've gone through every possible variant that there has been, and we've captured all of those variants in our studies. Our trial is a perpetual platform trial, so we're always measuring any number of drugs. And the report that you're hearing about today is from a trial where one of the arms was fluvoxamine. We compared that to a multi-component placebo arm. There were about 4 or 5 different arms going on at that time. So at that time, it was, there was a Brazilian variant that was dominant there. But of course, it's time. Things have moved on, and we've evaluated different interventions in the trial, but we've kept going with the measuring of the variants. Now, a few months ago, just prior to Omicron, we restarted the fluvoxamine arm versus placebo. So we discontinued that about a week and a half ago. We showed the very same treatment effect among about 1,200 patients. And, this would be a different variant now. So in my opinion, most drugs tend to work relatively in a similar way. The other thing is, our understanding of this virus is somewhat limited. How different is Omicron from the Delta variant? Well, we believe that they're all similar coronavirus. So I think you would expect drugs that work for this particular virus to work across the variants. I'd be surprised where that's not the case. And maybe that's the case with monoclonals, but I think with broad spectrum antivirals, it's much less the case. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Mills. And I'm glad you mentioned the monoclonals, because I'm sure many people are thinking about the difference in efficacy. Dr. Eric Armbach, I see your hands up.
Thank you for, I've got a quick question for Dr. Young, which is on Paxlavid, like what percentage of the patients that are at high risk or really at risk for hospitalization are ineligible due to the contraindications for this particular drug, right? So this gets at like, if, when you listed sort of it's not used in these particular cases, like, have we just in many ways like created a product that isn't useful in the highest risk or the most meaningfully risk group category, and therefore considering its relative risk or the observed sort of efficacy sort of skews it, because we're like, it's not really applicable to the most vulnerable population that we're trying to prevent a hospitalization on. Remember, these are, at least I try to remind myself, these are treatments that are used in an outpatient setting, right, with the goal to prevent the hospitalization. Just, can you give me a sense of like, is it a relatively small number of patients that would be considered essentially ineligible for this treatment based on the contraindications you described? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I actually had looked into it to try and find a solid number previously, but not surprisingly, there isn't one. But when you actually look at, I believe it's the CDC that has a list of all the potential interactions, right? That this drug, and I just listed a few of them actually.
Yeah,
it's quite a long list, and so it's going to be, I think, a substantial proportion of patients that could have a contraindication to this, that have a drug interaction.
Yeah, contraindication may be the wrong term, but thank you. But really, it means a clinician would say it's probably not, at least it's unlikely that I would recommend that clinically because of the drug interactions, et cetera. Okay.
Looks like Dr. Bimraj has a.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dr. Amber. If you look at the list on the FDA, it's very intimidating. And I have a feeling a lot of clinicians' enthusiasm or patients' enthusiasm is very less because of that. The uptake has been less. But I call my friendly pharmacist because I don't have the bandwidth, my ID pharmacist, and I ask them, like, how real is this, again, drug interaction? How concerned should we be? And sometimes it's an informed decision with the patient. And some patients chose and they did okay. And some patients did not choose. I don't think these are absolute contraindications. So that totally says we can't use the drug. I think we just have to have some informed discussions with the patient. And you bring up a good point. You have a patient, not all immunocompromised patients are at equal risk. You have somebody who's got heart transplant as an acute rejection, that risk is totally different for somebody who's got a kidney transplant who's stable at the age of, who's got vaccinated at 6 years. So I think as clinicians, we don't have good clinical prediction rules. We have to use our clinical judgment, weighing the risk versus weighing the potential drug interactions with the Paxlavid. At least I have been doing that, and most of my transplant ID colleagues have been doing that.
Thank you. Very informative. Dr. Don Casey, your hand's up.
Thanks. In follow-up to Reem's question, related to vaccination status in the groups that were presented are obviously very low to not at all. And so globally, I understand there's a high degree of variation across geopolitical areas around the penetrance, so to speak, of vaccination. But it seems to me as though certainly in the US now, many more people are vaccinated. I wonder if there's any update on what influence vaccination status might have going forward in terms of both the baseline risk and the overall and the risk of complications and adverse events and death. I wonder if you've gotten that far.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, we know that vaccination reduces the risk of hospitalization, right? And from what I think has death as well. But in terms of its interactions with treatment, like I think we incorporated some assumptions that I think Mel probably can speak to. Mel Wentington.
Yes, hi everyone. We did incorporate vaccination in the model, which I can allude to a little bit, but that really reduced the risk of hospitalization and subsequent mortality. So I'm not aware of evidence available at this time of a difference in relative risk for those vaccinated and unvaccinated. So that's an area I believe that we're all still waiting for in clinical evidence, but it is an element we did incorporate in the model by way of reducing the risk of hospitalization for the proportion of cases that we assume to be among vaccinated folks.
Yeah, I raised the point because there are large numbers of people who are unvaccinated, and here we think, vaccination status has been of critical importance, but there may be a need to prioritize maybe those who are unvaccinated. I don't know the answer to that, but it's looming in my mind.
That's correct, and there is a prioritization scheme that one of which, one of the high categories is folks who are unvaccinated and are simultaneously at high risk because of supply issues, right, with these treatments being rolled out.
So in the trial we've been running in predominantly in Brazil, the event rate has gone down by about 2/3 among what is now a predominantly vaccinated population. So the same trial we ran, less than a year ago, the event rate went from about 16% in a control group to about 5%. So quite a big difference. And as a result, any future trials, they're going to have to be considerably larger. There still are events happening, but they're going to be quite a bit larger. And I would encourage guideline panels to consider outcomes that are easier to measure than hospitalization, for example, things like time to recovery.
Thank you.
Otherwise, we're going to have lived through a period of time where only those who ran a trial 6 months ago are ever going to be able to complete the trial.
Well, thank you all. I think this was an excellent discussion. So it sounds like we're dealing with a different population as far as the absolute risk for these outcomes. But the medication, the efficacy, the relative risk reduction probably is consistent. Very good. I don't see any other hands. I would say, why don't we go ahead with Dr. Melanie Wentington, who will present about the effectiveness model, please, to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mel Whittington. I'm the Director of Health Economics at ICER, and I led the economic modeling for this review. Next slide. I want to first acknowledge two of my ICER colleagues who made this work possible, including Noemi Fluch and Marina Richardson. Next slide. The objective of this portion of our public meeting and this portion of our report was to estimate the cost effectiveness of molnupiravir, Paxlavid, and fluvoxamine, the three interventions that Kai introduced, for the treatment of COVID-19. At earlier phases of our review, we did include REGEN-COV and sotrovimab as interventions of interest, so you can find their results in our report using evidence from prior to Omicron. But due to their revision in the EUA and not being currently authorized in the United States, we aren't emphasizing them during our meeting today. Next slide. So let's get into a bit of our methods so we can understand our results and keep these methods in mind when you're interpreting our results and conclusions. We first developed a two-part decision analytic model that included a decision tree followed by a Markov model, and I'll present that in much more detail in the next slide. Our setting was that of the United States from the healthcare sector perspective as our base case, so including direct medical costs and health outcomes for the patient. We included a modified societal perspective as a scenario, and I'll also present those results here today. Our time horizon was that of a lifetime, with all future costs and consequences discounted at 3% per year. And our primary outcomes included the quality adjusted life year, the equal value life years, and hospitalizations. Next slide. So here's our model schematic. As I mentioned, there's two parts. Our first part is on the left-hand side. This is our decision tree. Essentially, this models the time that an individual had and was recovering from COVID-19 in the short term. So this is about 30 days in alignment with the pivotal trials. And the purpose of this portion of the model was to track the highest setting of care that a patient received for their COVID-19 infection. So this could be outpatient management alone, whether that escalated to an emergency department visit, and whether that is escalated to a hospitalization. And within hospitalization, we were able to track the severity of respiratory support required. So whether or not oxygen was needed, whether or not non-invasive or mechanical ventilation was needed. From this acute phase decision tree, patients then funneled into a two health state Markov model that's on the right hand of our screen. The health states were alive and dead, and we essentially tracked survival over the lifetime time horizon. For those who experienced long-term consequences of COVID-19, we assigned an increase in mortality, a reduction in quality of life, and an increase in healthcare costs based on recent US recommendations. We did assign these long-term consequences to those who were discharged alive from a hospitalization that required mechanical ventilation. And again, that was in alignment with recent recommendations, but we understand that this will be a fruitful area for evidence generation and patient engagement going forward. Next slide. So here are key model assumptions. I want to spend a good deal of time on these, so it's important to understand our results. First and foremost is the baseline characteristics were consistent across all intervention arms and the comparator arm. From numerous conversations with clinical experts, we heard that individuals would relatively be eligible for each of these treatments. That was relatively consistent across each of these treatments. Sure, there would be different considerations based on pregnancy or these drug-drug interactions we just discussed, but these would be relatively consistent across all intervention arms. So the same age and same gender was used as model start for all intervention arms in the comparator arm. Secondly, the evidence for the comparator was based on a pooling of the usual care arms from each pivotal trial. This part was tough. As we all know through our lived experience, as Kai so nicely illustrated, the COVID-19 pandemic is evolving. It changes over time. We have new variants. And so we wanted to be able to capture that heterogeneity. And so we actually pooled evidence from each of the pivotal trials to get this comparator arm. And we believe that strengthened our approach because it captured different time periods. It captured different variants. It captured different patient populations. And hopefully that heterogeneity in each pivotal trial, when combined, can be ideally more representative of what this comparator actually is. Number 3 here is that the relative treatment effects from the trials were applied to the outcomes from the pooled usual care evidence. Now, I just said there's these systematic differences in these trials. We've already emphasized this. And so because of that, we do not compare the cost effectiveness between the interventions. Because of these systematic differences could result in different relative treatment effects between the treatment. And so we don't compare between treatments, and we caution you not to compare the cost effectiveness between treatments as well. Number 4 is that we modeled death as downstream of hospitalization. We did not add an additional benefit associated with mortality outside of what death might be averted by averting certain hospitalizations. And the reason for this was twofold. One, because of the absolute numbers were just so small, as Kai emphasized, but also just the clinical rationale that death should really be downstream of hospitalization, that deaths are very unlikely to occur if an individual is managed in the outpatient care setting. And number 5, I alluded to in the previous slide, but that was that the long-term consequences were assigned, long-term consequences of COVID-19. So this idea of long COVID that we sometimes refer to, those were assigned for those discharged following a hospitalization that required mechanical ventilation. This was based on recent US recommendations, but again, we know this is an area that's going to continue to evolve. Patient engagement is going to be necessary. The model is flexible to expand these assumptions, but that is what we use in our base case. Next slide. Our population included individuals with mild to moderate COVID-19 and a high risk of progression to severe disease or hospitalization. Our population included both vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, because hearing from clinical experts and reviewing the EUAs, we don't expect these treatments to only be reserved for those unvaccinated. However, the pivotal trials contained nearly no individuals who were vaccinated. Therefore, we had to make adjustments to the risk of hospitalization and death observed in those pivotal trials for the percent of cases that were assumed to occur among vaccinated individuals to account for the effectiveness of the vaccine in reducing these outcomes. So using recently available evidence, approximately 30% of all COVID cases are occurring among those who are vaccinated. And so for that portion of our total cohort, we reduced the risk of hospitalization and death that we had calculated from pooling across the pivotal trials. Next slide. Here are our usual care outcomes. Again, these are calculated by pooling across the pivotal comparator arms of the pivotal care trials and then adjusting for the vaccination status. So the highest setting of care, around 95%, were managed with outpatient management alone, 1.5% in an emergency department visit, and then around 3.6% a hospitalization. We also tracked the level of respiratory support required among those hospitalized. Around 26% received no oxygen support, 35% received low flow oxygen, 29% received either high flow oxygen or non-invasive ventilation, and 10% received mechanical ventilation. Next slide. The treatment effectiveness was primarily driven by the relative risk of a hospitalization. And so the relative risk of a hospitalization for molnupiravir, Paxlavid, and fluvoxamine are presented on this slide. A treatment could also influence other areas, such as the level of respiratory support required. We haven't seen evidence to suggest a meaningful impact of these treatments on reducing respiratory support required, but if the evidence does become available, these treatments would become more favorable in cost effectiveness. Next slide. Here are the treatment costs. Molnupiravir, we estimated a treatment course acquisition cost of $707 based on the government contract negotiated price. For Paxlovid, around $530, again, based on the government contract negotiated price. And then fluvoxamine, around $12 for a treatment course based on the generic pricing available. Next slide. Here are our COVID-19 related disutilities. These disutilities were assigned in that first phase of our model, the decision tree that tracked the acute phase of the COVID-19 infection. These were, every single individual received the disutility of the outpatient management alone for their symptom days. And then if they escalated to a higher setting of care, an additional disutility was added on to that. Next slide. Now let's get into the results. Here are our base case model outcomes. You'll see a row for each treatment as well as a row for our usual care, which is again based on pooling across the pivotal trials and then adjusting for the vaccination coverage. You'll see that molnupiravir, Paxlovid, and fluvoxamine all have fewer inpatient hospitalizations than usual care, which results in higher quality adjusted life years, and equal value of life years. You'll see these three treatments have slightly higher costs than usual care. And this total cost column includes not only the treatment cost and the condition-related care, but also general population healthcare costs over this lifetime time horizon. Next slide. And here are our base case incremental results. You'll see we present outcomes of cost per equal value life year gained, cost per quality gained, cost per life year gained, and cost per inpatient hospitalization averted. For molnupiravir, the incremental cost per equal value life year gained was around $58,000. For Paxlovid, it was around $20,000. And for fluvoxamine, it was around $8,000. And so you'll see across the estimates in this table, all of these incremental cost effectiveness ratios were beneath commonly used thresholds of 100,000 to 150,000. Next slide. We conducted numerous sensitivity analyses, one of which was a one-way sensitivity analysis to assess the robustness of the results and to identify the key drivers of the model to help us understand what elements do we need to be able to estimate and reduce uncertainty for. These key drivers, as we all can probably expect, was the relative risk of hospitalization, so the treatment's effect on hospitalization, as well as the baseline risk of hospitalization. So what did, how frequent was hospitalization in the comparator arm? For molnupiravir, the estimates from our one-way sensitivity analysis ranged from around $30,000 to north of $1 million per quarterly on things that far exceeded commonly used thresholds. And why we're seeing such a high number as the upper bound here is they had a large confidence interval that was near 1. And so when you're using estimates of near 1, it becomes no longer cost effective for the relative risk of hospitalization. Paxlovid ranged from nearly cost saving to around $30,000 for equal value life year gained, and fluvoxamine ranged from cost saving to $20,000 for equal value life year gained. The estimates I report here use the outcome of equal value life year gained. The results for the quality adjusted life year were very similar. Next slide. So we conducted numerous scenario analyses, one of which was the modified societal perspective. In this modified societal perspective, we included 2 key components, one being patient productivity gains or losses during that acute phase infected period, and a second being ICU capacity considerations. And we did this by calculating the excess deaths averted associated with reduction in ICU capacity. And so we from recently available evidence on excess deaths that occur based on ICU capacity, we calculated the excess deaths averted if we went from where total ICU capacity is down to ICU capacity that didn't involve any COVID-19 patients. Next slide. These are the results of our modified societal perspective. You'll see at the top half of this table are the threshold prices for a treatment course from the societal perspective. And at the bottom half of this table, you'll see the threshold prices from the healthcare sector perspective. So as expected, you'll see these prices are higher in the societal perspective as compared to the healthcare sector perspective when we incorporate these additional elements. Similar to what I was saying about long COVID and how this will be an area for fruitful development of evidence, the modified societal perspective illustrates this as well. Undoubtedly, I think we are all aware of the very large societal impact of COVID-19. But an issue that is less understood is how do these treatments actually influence the societal perspective? And that's what we're trying to incorporate in our analysis, not the full economic burden of COVID-19, but where do these treatments actually, where can they actually move the mark on that economic burden and societal burden of these? And so we have captured that based on productivity and ICU capacity as a way to attribute those to the treatment. And so just keep it in mind when you're considering the societal perspective. And we're thinking, try to remove the large economic and societal burden of COVID-19 to where can these treatments actually make a mark on. Next slide. Here's a scenario analysis of a lower probability of hospitalization. We heard that from Dr. Mills earlier that we're seeing this decline in hospitalization over time. And so this scenario assumes a hospitalization of around 1.8%, so around half of what we assumed in our base case. And you can see that these estimates are now higher. The cost effectiveness is a higher number, but it's still beneath commonly used thresholds of 100,000 to 150,000. So for molnupiravir, now we're around 71,000 for equal value life year gained, Paxlovid around 32,000 for equal value life year gained, and fluvoxamine around 20,000 for equal value life year gained. Next slide. So limitations similar to our assumptions. I want to be very transparent about our limitations so you can keep that in mind when considering our results. And the first probably goes without saying, but the COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve. New variants emerge, vaccination uptake slowly increases, the role of booster vaccination becomes a major issue. And so we have to keep that in mind. Our current approach to estimate the hospitalization risk, which is a key driver of the model findings, was based on what was observed in the pooling of the pivotal trials. So we did pool across the pivotal trials for fluvoxamine, sotrovimab, and molnupiravir. We also included in that pooling sotrovimab and Regencov. So all 5 of those interventions were included in that pooling. We did not remove Regencov and sotrovimab from the usual care following its EUA revision because both of those trials had more than 90% of their population from the United States, so very representative for our population, and it wasn't related to the treatment arm. That data was not related to the treatment arm that we used, it was related to the usual care. So we still feel confident that including that improves our analyses and our approach. And the third limitation here, the long-term consequences potentially associated with COVID-19 continues to be studied with no evidence on whether these treatments influence the risk or severity. So again, as we gather more data and more patient input on what this looks like, we also need to see where do these treatments actually move the mark on these consequences. Next slide. We're grateful for the number of public comments we received. We believe they've strengthened our review. One of the comments was to do not compare interventions to each other. We have not ever compared the interventions to each other, and we hope we have made that clear, that we are not comparing the interventions to each other due to those systematic differences in the trials and definitions of outcomes and for other reasons. Second, numerous comments encouraging us to compare each intervention to its respective clinical trial comparator and forgo the use of the pooled analysis for the usual care arm. And I think I've already emphasized the strengths of the pooled analysis earlier on in the presentation. The third was to model deaths based on the deaths reported in the trial rather than as downstream of hospitalization. This was an area where we had a lot of thoughtful conversations on, and due to the very small numbers of deaths, as well as the clinical rationale that deaths really should be downstream of hospitalization, we did not modify our approach. Number 4 was to exclude the vaccination parameters from the base case analysis. In our report, you will see a scenario analysis that does just include an unvaccinated population, but due to these EUAs not being restricted only to those unvaccinated, and for these treatments being used in both populations, we did not exclude this from our base case. And last, to present the modified societal perspective as a co-base case. Again, evidence on the modified societal perspective. Undoubtedly, we know of the large economic burden of COVID-19. How much we can alleviate by those treatments is still to be determined. Next slide. And so to conclude, our analyses suggest that each outpatient intervention does produce improved clinical outcomes. At their current government negotiated or generic prices, each intervention is estimated to meet standard cost effectiveness levels in the US healthcare system, even under our scenario that assumed a lower hospitalization risk that may reflect the current Omicron wave. The cost effectiveness findings are primarily driven by a treatment's ability to reduce hospitalization and the baseline probability of hospitalization. So those are 2 key inputs that will be important to look to going forward. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wentington. This was, again, excellent presentation, well organized and comprehensive summary. I don't see any hands raised, but I have a question, so I'll start with that. Maybe it's 2 actually. The first is just a confirmation. So I believe the effect estimate you used in the model for fluvoxamine, it was really based on the effect estimate of people who continued, who adhered to the medication. You didn't, so it was 68% instead of using the 33%, which was the overall relative risk reduction. Is that correct?
So I think what's alluding to is the potential confusion where in the clinical section, we presented the relative risk reduction, and then in our section, we presented the relative risk. So 1 minus the relative risk reduction. Okay. So I think Kai and I's numbers are actually in alignment with each other when framed that way.
But so just to confirm, you used the overall effect estimate for everybody who was in the trial. You did not use the effect estimate for people who had more than 80% adherence. Okay. Very good. I think one other question is really in relation to the assumption that death is only a consequence in the hospital. And I would say that the one obvious patient group that assumption may not be valid or it doesn't apply to, especially people elderly who are in long-term care facilities. So I know in the state of Kansas, for example, especially at the time when we had higher rates of hospitalization, there were quite few deaths in nursing home that never made it to the hospital. So it would be nice to make just maybe a comment overall on how, if these are true, how would they affect the cost effectiveness, in which direction?
That's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. This was tough about where do we assign mortality, and from the trials, the pivotal trials, all deaths did occur after hospitalization. But I know that's not comprehensive of everything. If there were more deaths in the outpatient setting, these treatments would probably become slightly less cost effective, given that number would probably be pretty small. And that's because in our population that receives these interventions, you have more folks that are in the outpatient setting. So if you assign a risk of mortality, that would reduce some of the mortality savings that we're seeing in the hospitalization. But I anticipate that number would be quite small, and so it would have a pretty small to negligible impact on the findings.
Great, thank you. I see Dr. Falkkeller's hand is up. Please go ahead.
Just real quick, you mentioned it. I just need to wrap my head around it, that you said you would account for Omicron. But so the transition point sounded more like Delta to me. And, we now know that it's 2/3 to 80% less likely to be on the vent and die under Omicron. How again, and so I was a little surprised that actually the numbers were so low, the cost per quality were so low. So how again did you account for that?
Yes, and sorry, let me ask a follow-up question to that. Were you thinking that we had adjusted for that somewhere in our analysis?
I just saw the last slide quickly go over that you said it would be valid for Omicron as well.
Okay, okay, I'm following now. So we assumed a lower hospitalization scenario analysis, and these numbers were still less than 100,000 per quality adjusted life year. But what you're pointing out is valid. We don't know exactly what that hospitalization rate may be, but we're seeing at a lower hospitalization rate of around 2%. That's what these estimates are, still beneath 100,000 per quality.
Right, there's two things, right? The low hospitalization, but there's also when you are hospitalized, the chance of getting actually onto the vent and or die is much lower as well. It's about 2/3 to 80%. Maybe Adarsh can enlighten me, maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong, but that's my understanding. When I looked at some pediatric data out of Canada, that's exactly how it looked like. I don't know whether they have super good data right now for that, but that's how it looked like. That would affect, I think, massively on your cost per quality.
That you're right, it would influence it. We did not reduce the respiratory support required. Assuming in this lower probability of hospitalization, we assume the same progression to these higher levels of respiratory support. I don't think it would drive it massively because we aren't assuming a treatment effect on any of those. And so yes, of course, obviously the more people we get in mechanical ventilation, there are consequences to that. So preventing hospitalization gets the benefit of preventing those. But so you're certainly right, it would have an influence, but I don't think it'd be a massive one.
Thank you. Don, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I appreciate the notation of the modified societal perspective. That's very helpful. But I have a couple of questions, and maybe the first is more of a comment, but the notion that and I think you reflected in your report, that we're still trying to assess, let's say, the probability for future chronic illness caused by a COVID infection of any sort is uncertain at this point, but there's obviously a lot of work in there. The second part, though, is, we've kind of been spoiled making ceteris paribus assumptions around the discount rate. And I'm wondering if you have a reflection on the role of expected inflation now and the need for us to, incorporate that in, knowing that it's tied to other factors such as supply and demand. And this would be important outside the US, probably more so than here, but I'm just wondering if what your thoughts are about the discount rate assumptions now, whether they should be modified going forward.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, something that's certainly discussed widely in the health economic circles. From my last look, the inflation rate in just medical care has not increased as dramatically as what we are all seeing in other areas of the supply chain. So I don't think there's been any recommendation to increase these discount rates per se. But I think it'll be an area that we continue to hear conversation on, but we are still in alignment with best practices of this 3%.
Linda, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for this presentation. It was wonderful. A thought occurred to me. We're talking about people with mild symptoms, but who are at risk for progressing to severe disease. When I think about low-income people who may have mild symptoms, they could be, for obvious reasons, reluctant to go pursue the follow-up their care, because of perceptions about cost. Do you have any sense of if everyone who was at high risk and experienced mild symptoms actually went and got a diagnostic follow-up, got a test, got treatment, kind of what effect that might have on these outcomes and on the models? I'm also thinking about those groups that may do outreach and how that might inform our outreach and education efforts.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know if anybody else has a good answer.
Let me try. Hi, Linda, by the way. Thank you for joining us in the meeting today. And others can comment as well, but cost effectiveness is essentially agnostic as far as how many people use the treatment. So the numbers don't change if it's 10 people or 10 million in that regard. It certainly matters to decision makers because they have to manage budgets, but it's more looking at the incremental health and the cost offsets kind of as part of the value, if you will. So we will talk a bit about what the experience has been so far with the distribution of these treatments and whether there was an anticipated uptake and whether that's happened or not and what the lessons learned are. So come back with that kind of question again when we talk about the distribution issues, because I think managing the budget impact and how the government even thought about that ahead of time in the price is something that we'll definitely come back to.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm just going to have a quick comment, Adarsh. I see your hands up, but also something that I'm very interested to hear about is in relation to the distribution or the accessibility of these treatments in rural setting. So not only for certain socioeconomic status, but a lot of the states are dealing with very different situations and scenarios in rural versus urban setting, which would be nice to also comment on at one point. Adarsh, to you.
Thanks, Reem, and thank you, Dr. Wentington. That was a very insightful presentation. I'm going to preface by saying that I'm not a health economist. I'm just a lowly clinician who sees patients. But there's something I struggle with as a clinician and also being in the guideline panel is the outcome of hospitalization. For me, it's an intervention. It is at best an imperfect proxy of disease severity, let alone patient suffering. And part of the trials too, like Ed Mills said, why don't they measure that? And again, for me, that would have been a better outcome. And we have to make decisions like in the peak of the pandemic, people who need to be hospitalized don't get hospitalized. It's why people seek care, why a particular physician on what night, on what mood, and what he is gets admitted. It's a behavioral, again, there's so many other determinants of hospitalizations. I don't know, not just for this, how do you guys struggle with that as a proxy?
Yeah, I actually think that's what strengthens economic models is sure, our model accounted for hospitalizations. It also counted other things. It accounted for time to symptom resolution. It accounted for quality of life while you are having this acute phase of COVID-19. It accounts for long-term consequences of COVID-19 based on recent recommendations. So that might be one of our kind of key outcomes and what really drove the model, but we accounted for numerous other events as well. And so a lot of people refer to models as like this Frankenstein approach, where you put all these pieces together and you get this this complete model. And so I think, yes, hospitalization was a big chunk of that, but we incorporate other outcomes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, I see hands up.
I was just going to piggyback on Adarsh's comment because I really appreciate his thinking there. And the one thing I would sort of add to this is I do think that the model that is developed, because it has a quality of life component to it, does get at the idea of disease burden. But we got to understand that, like, when people stay at home, even if it's painful or or it's an incredible burden to their family and caregivers, for a period of time while they're dealing with COVID, it's in effect relative to the hospitalization free. Like, there's not much of a cost that's associated with home care. And, I do think he raised an interesting point, though, that I never really considered until he said this, is that during certain points in this pandemic, like, we didn't send people who needed to go to the hospital because the hospitals couldn't accommodate that volume. We're like, just grin and bear it and hope it works out for you at home. And I wonder what effect that has on hospitalization as this proxy for effectiveness in this particular study, because it's contextual. Like, what did the hospital volume look like at a particular point in time as to whether or not it was in play. Now, I understand that, like, one of the studies, occurred basically with no one in America. So it's maybe that was not, that was the predominantly Brazilian study, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that was not such a factor, but it's something in the back of my mind. I'm like, oh, I've got to really rethink my interpretation of hospitalization as this proxy for effectiveness, because there are a couple other factors I hadn't really considered until this discussion. So just want to say thanks to the group for that one, for making it more complicated.
Well, Mel, I'm assuming you agree with the complexity, but there is not a specific response.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't know that one. I was expecting a response. I would say that these, I agree at this variation in time of pandemic, and now we're 2+ years into this. These trials, Kai could correct me if I'm wrong, but they were around starting May 2021. So it was a year into the pandemic at that point. And so I am only a health economist. I'm not a clinical expert. I wonder how much we were seeing that phenomenon of don't go to the hospital, a year into the pandemic. Also, to maybe support hospitalization being a decent proxy for, highest setting of care needed, is we didn't see any deaths coming out of those were ED visit or outpatient management alone. So it didn't seem to be patients were, grinning and bearing it out at home and then having a severe case.
Thanks, Mel. Adarsh, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So Melanie, as much as I hate to say, depending on the geographic area, even within the US, even late 2021, we were at surge capacity. We were even thinking of, if you are a COPD patient, you just crank up your oxygen, you don't have to come in. So even in resource, I'm not going to say where resources were available, I think there were situations where we did not admit patients who would have otherwise been admitted, even later in the pandemic.
I'd say in St. Louis, for example, we were on elective. I mean, we essentially went to elective procedures, right? So canceling elective procedures due to hospital volumes, right? During that period of time. So it's just an interesting factor. I think Adarsh is right. Like, there were periods in many places in the country where referral patterns for use of hospitalization changed substantially for weeks or maybe even longer.
That's very true. Aaron, I see your hands up.
Only because I'd actually like to ask and almost respond to this. These are still randomized controlled trials, unless I'm misunderstanding something. So regardless of what was going on with hospitalization and how constrained it was, clinicians knew whether these patients got placebo or a drug, and it reduced the relative hospitalization amongst the population that got the drug. So whether we were constrained, whether it was relatively open, whether it's physicians have different styles, you would hope that randomization would have accounted for much of that. And even with all of those variables, the drug prevented hospitalization relative to getting a placebo. So I actually wasn't as upset about, or like concerned about, I guess, the use of hospitalization, knowing all these other factors. I would be if it wasn't randomized and blinded, but as far as I know, it was.
Yeah, if I can quickly comment to that, absolutely. I think if you trust and value hospitalization and outcome, then it was equally distributed. The question is, do we? I think it's not a matter of there's any confounding, there's any bias. It's a matter of, is it really a patient important outcome? Again, and this is value judgment, and that's where I was coming at.
Okay, excellent. Kurt, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. My question is around the disutility of the ED visit versus hospitalization. I was curious as to why that was equal.
Great point. So the value, you're right, was equal. The duration was different. So the duration assigned to an ED visit was shorter than a duration assigned for hospitalization. And interestingly, the utility aren't big drivers of the model here because we aren't seeing this impact on the resolution of symptoms or shortening up these utilities. So the utilities are applied for a pretty short period of time over the lifetime time horizon. But great point. Same utility estimate, different duration.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you again. Excellent discussion. Brings up a lot of important points that I'm sure we're going to come back to later in the day. Thank you again, Dr. Young and Dr. Whittington, for excellent presentations. I don't see any other hands up, so I think we can move to the public comment part. And here, I'm going to ask, just similar to what we always do in ICER, for the speakers to please declare any potential conflict of interest before delivering your remarks. And I am gonna ask you to really limit your remarks to the 5 minutes that you've been informed about. And if you go over, I will have to stop you. We are gonna start with